Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start off with some news out of the ACC. We're going to talk a little bit about what Clemson and Florida State's next steps are. Obviously, they filed lawsuits against the ACC, but what comes after this is really the big question here. And then we're going to jump into some of the comments by Deion Sanders over the last week. He has been in the news quite a bit over the last couple of weeks with some of the comments about his recruiting style or where his son is possibly going in the draft. A lot of different things to jump into there. Then we have a little bit of a recruiting update, as this weekend was absolutely crazy in the world of recruiting. Tons of big-time players committing, a couple of flips here and there, so tons to talk about on that front. And then we're going to finish it off with a Good Vibes Monday, and we're going to talk about all the quarterbacks that have waited their turn, that have bided their time, and are finally getting their chance at quarterback, whether it's at the school that they've been at for quite some time or at a different school, but they're finally getting a chance to step into that spotlight. So huge, very excited for that segment. Definitely stick around for that. But before we start, I do want to remind everyone that we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to see your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth, or I can answer a question that you're wondering about, you can use the link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all to have kind of a fun, interactive session here where you guys can ask a question or bring up something that maybe I didn't know or I hadn't brought up yet, and we can have a fun, interactive time here. But let's jump right in. Obviously, the big talk of the town right now is what's going on with the ACC, and a lot of new court cases have been starting to pile up around the ACC headquarters in North Carolina, and one of them, the most recent one, has been Clemson. Clemson has sued the ACC mainly over the exorbitant exit fee that they are trying to charge. It looks like it's somewhere in the range of $130 to $150 million, much more than any other conference. I believe the SEC is the next highest, and that is $45 million with no notice, which is what this essentially would be. And obviously, they can afford to do that, but at the end of the day, there obviously is a huge difference between what the ACC is charging to leave their conference and what everyone else is. So it's definitely a big topic of conversation. Dennis Dodd did a great piece on CBS just talking about the ongoing cases with the ACC and kind of where it's all leading. Because as we all know, I've talked about it a number of times on here, Clemson and Florida State are likely out of the conference. Anytime that something like this happens, pretty much right when it starts, it's mostly over, in the sense that once Florida State filed that lawsuit, at some point they were going to be out of the ACC. And Dennis Dodd, in this article, remarked that at first he thought it was going to be a 5 to 10 year process, partly because when you look at that media rights deal, it does go through 2036. So there's not as much leeway in terms of how much money you would have to give to ESPN. I think the number is sitting right around $572 million to get out of that right now. So there was thought for a long time that it was going to take a little bit of time for that number to come down, for them to feel more comfortable to pay that, and then find another place to, set up shop to be in a new conference. So I think Florida State, it felt like they just weren't pulling the necessary weight in terms of actually making things happen in a quick fashion, at least, making it happen in the way that we saw Texas and OU happen, which it felt like it obviously happened over, multiple months or at least a year where they were kind of building up to this point. But it felt like all of the things happened very quickly in the last two instances with Texas and Oklahoma, and then all of the stuff that happened with the Pac-12 a year ago. It felt like all of that was very quick. This one was going to be a little different, again, because of that 20-year deal that they signed back in 2016 that is, as I've said, has kind of handcuffed the ACC a little bit. It's made it really, really tough for them to essentially be able to keep up with the times. As we know, media deals are changing every single day. There's streaming getting involved. There's tons of more advertising money coming into the sport every single year. So keeping up with that pace was going to be nearly impossible when you sign a deal for this length of time, unless it has some crazy addendums that let you adjust on the fly, but it doesn't seem like this one does. So it was always going to be hard for the ACC to keep up. There were always going to be some teams that felt like they deserved some more money in these media rights deals, and when you split it all up, because I believe the ACC is sitting somewhere around 40 million per team. I think that's the right number. And then the ACC, or the SEC, excuse me, is sitting somewhere around 60, and then the Big Ten somewhere around 80 to 100, I believe, if I'm not mistaken there. So obviously a huge difference in those two things, and the ACC kind of handcuffed themselves back in 2016 when they made that deal. But at the end of the day, it felt like for a long time Clemson was going to have to wait this out a little bit and, bide their time in the ACC throughout this new playoff format, and then kind of reconvene in, 4 years to kind of figure out where they were all at. But then Clemson joined in, and things changed very quickly because, as we know, Clemson and Florida State are huge players in that conference, probably the two biggest players in that conference, although I think there's a big argument to be made about North Carolina. They feel like someone that once they join the fray, then everything gets very serious very quickly, and everything gets a lot more serious about not only what happens in the short term for the ACC, but what happens for these teams in the long term, because I think North Carolina is a team that no conference would have any question they would absolutely want in the fray, whether you're the Big Ten and you want the academics that go along with a lot of the other schools in that conference, or you want, the basketball program. Of course, everyone wants the basketball program over at North Carolina. So North Carolina is really the one that, in my opinion, has the clearest path towards not only getting out of the conference and kind of forcing the hand there, but also then finding a new place to set up shop, a new conference to be in, because that was one of the things that Dennis Dodd brought up in this is, while Florida State is a big-time school and everything, they have tons of, history within their football program and have a good athletic department and all of these great things, it doesn't seem like a lot of people around college football, or at least in this article, it seemed like there weren't a lot of people in the SEC and the Big Ten that were willing to take on Florida State and give up the breakup of that, 60 or I think 75 million is the number for the Big Ten, actually. So it felt like the Florida State just wasn't pulling enough weight. Now Clemson jumps into the fray and things get a little bit different, obviously. So the question is, what is kind of the plan after all of this? Because we know they're out of the conference. We know that likely all of this comes to a head where they can find a meeting ground somewhere in the middle where it's still going to be a big chunk of change. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, you get to move on. You get to do what you wanted to do and find a new place to be in, a new place to set up shop. But these two teams can't do any of that until they're out of the ACC. There is a clause in the ACC contract where no school can negotiate with another conference before they jump into another one, or before they leave the ACC, excuse me. So they essentially have to be fully out of the ACC before negotiations can start with a SEC or a Big Ten or maybe even a Big 12 in this scenario. So it didn't seem like there was a lot of traction with just Florida State. Clemson comes into the fray, things get a little bit more interesting, and it feels like at least they have a little bit stronger of legs to stand on, but the future is still very questionable, right? There's still a ton of stuff to figure out, and you still have to find your way out before you can even figure that stuff out. So a big thing here for them is finding their way out of the ACC as quickly as possible, and that's not always an easy thing, especially when you're the only two people fighting. But it sounds like there are some more people in the outside kind of watching this, and one of the quotes in here that I thought was very interesting from someone in the ACC circles to Dennis Dodd was, if you have 5 or 6 schools file a similar lawsuit to Clemson and Florida State, it kind of like a pack. It's kind of like a pack of lions going after a lion. So Right now, you got two of them. That's great. That's all well and good. But at the end of the day, not going to do a lot to align with two hyenas. If you get North Carolina, if you get Miami, excuse me, if you get those two schools in, now you got four. And then things get a little bit more interesting as Pitt and Louisville and Georgia Tech and all of these other schools start to watch from the sidelines where Clemson and Miami have been. Now they're on the on deck circle and they possibly are looking at the ACC some type of way. And as we know, the Clemson and Florida State lawsuits are two very different things. They're attacking the ACC from different angles, which makes me believe, at least, that there's more angles to come from. And this is kind of a coordinated attack. And whether they've been talking between schools or not, I'm not sure about that. But at the end of the day, it's very possible that Miami comes in with a lawsuit that is a totally different grievance with the ACC and comes from a totally different angle, and then North Carolina jumps in and they come from a different angle, and then maybe Virginia comes in from a different angle, because the huge thing about that is you can't group these together. You can't put all of these lawsuits under the same umbrella and kind of deal with them the same way. You'd have to deal with them on a case-by-case basis, which then elongates the time, and as we know, there's only so much money in the ACC offices. Obviously, they are not hurting right now, but as more of these pile up, it becomes more of a push for them to, I don't want to say compromise, because I think they do have to hold steady on certain things. I think that exit fee is going to be huge, just because when you look at the other conferences and the way that they're kind of dispersing and separating themselves from each other, you need as much money as you can, and if you're not going to get it from a massive media deal that is $572 million, as we talked about earlier, you're going to need to get it from somewhere. So I think the exit deal or the exit fee might be the thing that actually stays pat, while the media deal kind of has some leeway. Obviously, ESPN would be a big player in that, and they're kind of the biggest player in all of this. They're the person watching over all of this, knowing that they essentially pull the strings at any given moment in these conversations, because they can change up this at any point they want. So it's all very interesting. There's a ton of different things going into play, and one of the big things that Dennis Dodd broke down in this piece was when TV deals became a part of college football, when they were first introduced, I believe in the 80s, or the 70s maybe, if I'm not mistaken. SEC, Big Ten, and Notre Dame were the big winners from that conversation, and it's only really grown. I think those three entities are set up remarkably well. Obviously, Notre Dame has the extra caveat of being independent, so they don't get as big of a cut initially in the playoff, but if they make it, then they get, a cut near what the SEC and the Big Ten schools making. I believe the SEC and the Big Ten is somewhere around $21 million per school. Notre Dame sitting, I think, around $18 million if they do make the playoff. If they don't, I think it's $6 million. So obviously a huge difference there, but Notre Dame is still firmly a part of the conversation, especially if they continue the level of football that they've been playing over the last decade, because there's very few years where they're outside the top 12 teams in the country. So a lot of goes into this. There's going to be a lot of conversations behind the scenes about, are these guys viable? Do we want them in the conference? And one of the things that's going very, very in the Florida State and Clemson direction of finding a new place to play is one of the big things about college football. I think we can all agree one of the great things about it is the rivalries and the atmosphere around them. And if you go down the list of the biggest rivalries in college football, it used to be that they were a little bit spread out. It used to be, you had Texas and OU in the Big 12, you had Georgia, Florida in the SEC, you had Ohio State, Michigan in the Big 10. You had some big ones all over the place. It's kind of consolidated. Obviously, Texas and OU going to the SEC plays a huge factor. You also bring back Texas A&M. You add Oklahoma, Missouri, which I think is going to be a huge one going forward. And the SEC and the Big Ten essentially own a huge amount of the rivalries in the sport, which essentially means you own a huge amount of this sport. That's just kind of how the sport works. Everyone loves rivalry week. Everyone understands what those games mean, and they carry a lot of weight. And the SEC and the Big Ten, only one of those games, I think it was the top 10, 11 of the top, or 10 of the top 11, excuse me, non-playoff or bowl games that were watched were SEC or Big Ten rivalry games, including Texas and Oklahoma as they are going into the SEC this upcoming year. The only one that wasn't was Colorado State, which, as we remember, was a remarkable game that was absolutely off the walls. And it's Deion Sanders early in that season where pretty much everyone was watching. So it totally makes sense that they were the one that kind of thwarted all that. But at the end of the day, the SEC and the Big Ten have a big time hold on rivalries. But one of the things they don't have is Florida State, Miami. They don't have they don't have Clemson, South Carolina. They'd love to have a full grasp on that. There's tons of others. I mean, Miami, Florida, Florida State, Florida. Like, there's certain ones that you'd like fully under your umbrella if you can pull it off. And Clemson and Florida State are a big part of both of those conversations. So it'll be really interesting to see if that plays any part, if they can kind of flex their muscles on that front, because as we know with Florida State, if Florida State, Miami, and Florida for some reason are in the same roof at the SEC, although I think Florida State will likely make their way to the Big Ten if they were to get out of the ACC. If you were able to get all those guys in one conference, you have 3 weeks or 3 games at least of the season that are going to be must watch for most of the people in Florida. Everyone loves those games. Everyone has so much riding on those games. 90% of the people in Florida are fans of one of those teams, so it would hold so much weight, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. Clemson and Florida State kind of are on a little bit of tough footing with the Big Ten because they are not an AAU school, which essentially just means schools that reach a certain level of academics and research are awarded with an AAU role, and the Big Ten has tons of them. Essentially, every single school in the conference is an AAU school. Nebraska was an AAU school when they added them, and then they lost it a year later, and the Big Ten was not too happy about that. So Clemson and Florida State are not AAU schools. That could hurt them in those discussions, but Nebraska's already in there. It might be a little bit more lenient than some people are suggesting. But overarching on all of this is Clemson and Florida State need reinforcements. They're not going to get this done by themselves. Obviously, Clemson coming into the fray really helped Florida State, but they're going to need North Carolina. They're going to need Miami, and then we'll see what happens down the road. But Clemson and Florida State hold a lot of weight. They don't hold enough weight necessarily to entirely get the ACC to bend. So they're going to need North Carolina to come in and flex their muscles. They're going to need Miami to do the same, and then we'll see what happens. But for the time being, it looks like we're in for something of a long battle where there will be some twists and turns, but I tend to think those other schools will join, and then things will start to speed up pretty quickly. But we'll keep you updated on all of that stuff, of course, because this is going to be probably the biggest conversation over the entirety of the offseason. So we will definitely keep you updated there. But we are going to take our first break, and when we come back, we are going to come back with Deion Sanders. He has obviously been in the news a lot with some different recruiting information that came out about him that was a little bit defaming towards, or just kind of trying to say he was a quote-unquote lazy recruiter was one of the quotes I saw. Some comments on Shadur Sanders and Travis Hunter in the NFL draft. So plenty to talk about with Deion as always, but we will get to that right after this.